the perpetrator in this case, went by the zombie hunter. So they ended up calling him the zombie hunter killer. And this is one of those cases where once you think I'm done telling you all about it, I am not done. So get a snack, get a drink, get ready, because we are going to talk about Bryan Patrick Miller tonight. And if you are one of my patrons, you will be getting a video today. It's just going to be a little later than normal, mostly because I haven't filmed it yet. But I love you, and I told you you'd have a video today, Sunday the 10th, and you will. It's just, I'm on the wrong schedule, as you may be able to tell from behind me. It's definitely lighter than usual when I am filming, so you can see both of my backdrops at once. Anyway, enough about that. We are going, we're starting in 1992, November 8th, in fact. Angela Brusso, a tech worker who had recently moved to Phoenix, Arizona, was taking advantage of the beautiful weather to get in a little exercise, says Brianna Whitney, a true crime reporter for KPHO in Phoenix. I will be quoting Brianna and one of the detectives in this case quite a bit through this article, so you may want to remember her name. Each night, Angela would go out for her evening bike ride at the golden hour at sunset, the best time to be riding in the area. Now, Angela was just hours away from turning 22, and like a lot of locals, she liked to bike on the paths that ran alongside the city's distinctive canals. And that November evening, she left her apartment around 7 p.m., according to her boyfriend, Joe. Now, Joe said that he stayed at home because he wanted to bake Angela her birthday cake, and he really didn't expect her to be gone that long. But when hours go by, Joe starts to grow concerned when Angela has not come home. He tells the police the next morning that he took his own bike out 3 times that night, frantically looking for any sign of his girlfriend. He called her friends, he called her mother back in Pennsylvania, and finally reported her missing to the police. Unfortunately, it did not take the police long to find Angela. That morning, they found her torso in a field next to the trail that she had been riding her bike along. She had been stabbed to death. Approximately 10 days after her body was discovered, a man fishing along a section of the canal near where she had been discovered spotted her head stuck on a grate. Morgan Lowe, an investigative reporter who also works at KPHO, has been working on the Canal Killer, which is also this same zombie hunter case, for more than a decade. And Morgan said from what they heard from witnesses, Angela's head was in amazingly good condition, especially considering that this was like 11 days after her murder. She said that they have heard that the head looked as though it had been preserved, like it was to be a memento for the killer. Angela's purple mountain bike was also missing, and there were just no solid leads in her case. And really, it went cold until almost a year later in September of 1993, when the mother of 17-year-old Melanie Burness returned from a dinner date to find her daughter had broken her curfew and was not at home. She then noticed that Melanie's bicycle was missing. So, around 10:30, when Melanie is still not home, She remembers thinking it was strange, but she rode through the puddle and it splashed on her a little. She really felt like something about this puddle was not right, so her instincts convinced her to turn around and investigate. And then she realized that it was a puddle of blood. So she's stopped and she's looking at this puddle and she notices that near her there are drag marks, like towards a tree. They go around the tree and you can actually see the drag marks right back towards the canal. So Charlotte goes home and she calls the police because it's 1993 and there's no cell phones. And later that night, the local news report that a woman's body has been found in the canal, very close to where Angela Brosso's head had been discovered. Now at this point, detectives are wondering if they have a serial killer on their hands. They believe that Melanie had been targeted and stabbed in the back by the same person who had killed Angela. Police believe that somehow the killer got her off of her bike, whether he knocked her off or stopped her to ask her a question. And Detective Schwarzkopf, who I will mention several times, says that the evidence indicates that this killer approached the woman from behind. Both of the knife wounds were in the exact same position. Investigators say that the killer dragged Melanie's body off the path, removed her clothes, and then dressed her in a different outfit, which actually made her friends and family believe that it wasn't her until she had been identified. Now, along with the stabbing and the dismemberment, as if there's not enough, both women were SA'd. But that meant that the investigators had a crucial piece of evidence: DNA. So when the DNA from Melanie's scene was tested, it was matched to Angela's DNA that was found at the scene. Not her DNA, but the DNA found at her scene. I speak the right language sometimes. So police knew for sure that they were dealing with the same perpetrator. Unfortunately, the DNA did not have a match in their system. So these initial stab wounds were so precise that detectives suspected that this killer may even be like a surgeon of some kind. So the murders of Angela Brusso and Melanie Bernis in the early 1990s created fear in Phoenix that lasted for generations. Morgan said that people watched the news and they read the newspaper every day hoping that the police would make an arrest. And it just kept going on and on and on, and nothing happened. So, more than 2 decades passed, and the canal murder cases went cold until science finally caught up with the calendar. It is 2014, and some Phoenix police detectives are at a conference, a DNA conference, and a forensic genealogist from California is also at this conference. She is named Colleen Fitzpatrick, and she is the founder of Identifiers International, and she was there to meet with law enforcement to explain to them how she may be able to help with their cases. So Colleen's company had developed a software that could mine public genealogy databases, searching for matches to crime scene DNA. The detectives at first were kind of skeptical, and I didn't write down the exact way that it worked, but they agree to hear Colleen out. So they send her the DNA from the crime scenes in Phoenix, and Colleen's company starts 6 matches to the last name of Miller. Now I know what you're thinking. There's got to be a million Millers in the United States alone, right? So while genetic genealogy produces the name, Detective Schwarzkopf starts digging, and he said, I think there were a total of 6 Millers on what I called my master list. And I went down the list, and I got to Bryan Patrick Miller. So who is Bryan Patrick Miller? Records showed he was 42 years old at the time with a Phoenix address. And this name was just one of more than 600 people of interest who had been on this case file for years. He was placed there by a tip, but they, at the time, really didn't investigate him. And when Schwarzkopf starts digging, he realizes that Bryan Miller has a record that dates back to before the Canal murders. In May of 1989, when he was just 16, he crossed paths with a girl named Celeste Bentley. She was 24 years old, and she was headed to work, and she noticed a boy on the bus with her. Celeste gets off the bus, and the boy follows her off. Moments later, she feels something in her back. She states, he had run by me, and I thought he had just hit me. And I yelled at him. I was like, why did you do that? And I reached back, and I touched my back, and I realized that I was bleeding. I had been stabbed. With a single knife wound to her upper back, Celeste screamed and managed to make it to the store where she worked. A coworker called for help. About 30 minutes later, when Celeste was in the back of the ambulance, police approached her and said that they had found her perpetrator, and they wanted to bring him to the ambulance to show him to her. Celeste identified her assailant, and Bryan Miller was charged with aggravated assault. Celeste was told that if he had held the blade the other way, he would have gone straight through her ribs, and she would have died. Can you imagine? Bryan pled guilty, and he was sentenced to a juvenile detention until he turned 18. So, he was living in Hawaii when he was a young kid with his mom and dad, but his dad died in a motorcycle accident. So that is when Bryan and his mother Ellen moved to Phoenix. So for most of his life, early years and onward, it was just Bryan and Ellen. But when Bryan was in juvenile detention, his mom was cleaning up his room and kind of looking through his stuff, and she found like a journal. And in this journal, it had like a sinister plan. And it went something like this. Kidnap the girl, tie her up, cut her clothes off. He spelled out how he wanted to find, abduct, essay, murder, and dismember a woman. And Bryan's mom was so disturbed by this that she took it to the police. So when his 18th birthday rolls around and he is released from the juvenile detention center, his mom said, he's not coming back to live with me. I am scared of what he might do. So he ends up in a halfway house in Phoenix. But when Detective Schwarzkopf reads this note that was in the file, he's like, wait a minute, this sounds a lot like what happened to Angela, including the note about decapitation and preserving a head. So police want to locate Bryan, and It even had a full-sized zombie mannequin in the back and like dripping blood on the side. So his friend Eric says that Bryan's zombie hunter persona attracted a huge fan base, including law enforcement officers who had even lined up to pose for pictures with him. In fact, Bryan collected pictures of himself with cops like trophies. Eric says that Bryan's superhero character was the opposite of what Bryan was like when he wasn't in costume. He stated that he seemed like this harmless marshmallow guy who was just immersed in this goofy lifestyle. So police are wondering, can this guy be their killer? The only way to find out, they gotta get a DNA sample. So investigators start to surveil Bryan. He works at an Amazon warehouse, and every day when he gets there, he parks the zombie mobile in the same spot. Detective Schwarzkopf said he would come out for his 15-minute lunch break, blast his music super loud. Every lunchtime, out to the car, same thing, blasting this god-awful music. I don't know what it was, so I can't confirm that it was god-awful. So Detective Schwarzkopf comes up with this elaborate plan to get Bryan's DNA. He goes up and he approaches Bryan, and he says that he's a security consultant. He tells Bryan that thieves have been stealing things from the warehouse across the way, and he wants to know if Bryan would be interested in working for him as a security officer while he's outside. He even dangled money in front of him and was like, look, I'll pay you $20 an hour. So Bryan originally didn't agree. He was excited about the money, but he wasn't sure. So on January 2nd, 2015, the two met at a Chili's restaurant to fill out a job application and talk a little bit more. The cold case unit was behind the scenes, ready to bag anything that had Bryan Miller's DNA on it. They set a table for Bryan and Detective Schwarzkopf, kind of away from everyone in the public, you know. But Bryan arrives with a surprise guest, his 15-year-old daughter, Sarah. Bryan was a divorced single dad. So the three of them sat down and they order hamburgers. And according to Detective Schwarzkopf, Bryan swallows his burger in about 5 bites. And he won't take a drink of his water. So Detective is trying to, are you sure you don't want something? Do you want something to drink? You just got some water. And he kept saying, no, I'm good. So Detective starts to worry that this operation is going to be a bust. And then Bryan takes a drink from his water glass. And that's when Detective Schwarzkopf knows, okay, at least we got his DNA. So despite knowing what he knows about the juvenile record, by the time the meal ends, this veteran detective's gut says Bryan Miller's not their man. Seeing him with his daughter, he just couldn't see Bryan Miller being the monster that would kill these two women in 1992 and 93. After dinner, Bryan gives Detective Schwarzkopf a tour of the zombie hunter mobile, and the two part ways, with the detective saying he would be in touch. At this point, the cold case unit sends Bryan Miller's cup off to the crime lab. 11 days later, Detective Schwarzkopf gets a visit from a woman from the lab. She leans down and she says, "It's him." And Detective Schwarzkopf was in such disbelief, he said, "What?" And she says, "Bryan Miller, it's him." Detective Schwarzkopf said, I kind of sat back and I was like, you've got to be kidding me. So Bryan Miller's DNA matched a water glass from the water glass matched the DNA from Angela and Melanie's case from more than 20 years prior. Bryan Miller was arrested within hours, and during a police interview shortly after, when he was told why he'd been taken into custody, he was like, I didn't do this. And they were like, we have DNA that connects you. custody, they get a search warrant for his house, the one that he shares with his teenage daughter. And apparently everything that this man had ever collected in his life. Detective Schwarzkopf said, "I remember like it was yesterday walking up to the front door and everyone saying, 'You can't go that way. It's full of stuff.'" Bryan Miller's house looked like it came from the Hoarders TV show. But Schwarzkopf and his investigators would have to sift through all of it looking for other possible evidence. And Detective Schwarzkopf at this point also focuses on a news source, someone that Bryan Miller himself had ominously singled out in his own interview. He said that this person was the one person on earth he could possibly honestly say that he hated. Wait for it. Wait for it. Y'all know what I'm gonna say. It's his ex-wife. Her name is Aimee. And when she was interviewed, she told the police about some gruesome details from his past. He told her about the murder of a young girl who had come to his door accidentally. So we're gonna get there. In January 2015, more than 21 years after the Canal murders, Bryan Miller was charged with first-degree murder in both Angela Brusso and Melanie Bernis's death. Melanie's friend Rachel said that she felt a wave of relief, like a very joyous, "Oh my gosh, this is what we've been waiting for." Detective Schwarzkopf says he wants to talk to the person who probably knew Bryan the best, though, Aimee. They'd been married for 8 years, and they were now divorced. Aimee tells the detective that she was just 19 when she met him in 1996. They married less than a year later and moved to Everett, Washington. Now, Aimee tells the detective that Miller had revealed a secret to her, that he had killed a young girl in Phoenix years earlier before he'd even met Aimee. Aimee said that she never reported it to the police for a number of different reasons. Number one, she didn't know if it was true. Number two, she was afraid of him. And number three, she wanted to be a good wife. No, girl, no. Okay, so he tells Aimee that this young girl had come to his door, and he'd grabbed her and pulled her inside and killed her immediately. He told his wife that he had dismembered her and disposed of her remains in the trash left on the curb. Aimee said that he never told her this child's name. Investigators used the information she had told them to piece together who he may have been talking about. 13-year-old Brandy Myers was a little girl collecting money for a school book-a-thon in her North Phoenix neighborhood. She was going door to door, and Brandy's sister, Kristen, said, "I was a tomboy and she was a girly girl. She would try to learn how to climb trees or jump fences because she wanted to play with me. She was my best friend." It was May 26, 1992, 6 months prior to the murder of Angela. Bryan was living in the halfway house following his time in juvenile detention. It was 1 block from their school, Bryan's halfway house, and 3 blocks from their house, Kristen said. So every single day, they walked right by the halfway house. And Kristen said that night Brandy left home and she never came back. She was last seen 2 doors down from Bryan Miller's, walking in the direction of the halfway house. Despite an extensive search, Brandy's body was never found, and although Aimee could not provide a name, the clues in her account add up to just this one conclusion. Detective Schwarzkopf says that he believes that this girl was Brandy Myers, and her sister believes that as well. Her sister said Brandy went to a landfill, like something of no importance. So despite Aimee's account of this, detectives did not have enough evidence to charge Bryan Miller in Brandy's disappearance. But the fact that she was disposed of, that there was nothing forensically to grab onto, really disturbed Detective Schwarzkopf. who said that he had no involvement in Brandy's disappearance, that he'd never confessed to his ex-wife that he'd killed someone. But however, there is yet another case in Bryan Miller's past. In 2022, in 2002, a woman named Melissa Ruiz Ramirez is walking down the street in Everett at night, and somebody pulls over. It was Bryan, and Melissa would later tell police she'd seen him before talking to one of her friends. So she said she got in Bryan's car and told him she needed to make a call, and he drove her to his workplace so she could use the phone. She tells police she was on the phone, and from out of nowhere, he comes running at her with a 12-inch serrated kitchen knife and stabs her in the back. The two of them tussle over the weapon, but Melissa is able to escape and contact police. They picked Bryan up shortly after. Now, he didn't deny stabbing Melissa, but he said it was self-defense. He said it was at work when she came in off the street and asked to make a call. He said that she went to use the phone and then out of nowhere tries to rob him with the knife. So Bryan was arrested and charged with first-degree assault with a deadly weapon. He was jailed from May 2002 until his December trial. The jury didn't buy Melissa's story. It was kind of a he said, she said, and Bryan was acquitted. Aimee said a chilling change followed Bryan's return home. She said that it started with the letters that she'd gotten from her husband while he was in jail awaiting that trial. They started out as professing his innocence, and then they got into, deviance. Aimee told Detective Schwarzkopf that Bryan followed up on his words with action. There were times when they were intimate where he would tie her up, tie her down, make her perform intimate acts with a knife to her throat. And Aimee said that Bryan claimed that something had happened to him as a child that would become the cornerstone of his defense for murdering Angela and Melanie. His unique defense was that his mother had created a monster. So at the start of Bryan's trial for the murders of Angela and Melanie, in October of 2022, his attorneys opened up with a startling defense. They admitted that their client was the Canal killer. They had to concede right off the bat that he's the killer, but they said that he was not guilty by reason of insanity. His defense attorneys say that Bryan was tortured by his mother as a child, and this led to his violent behavior. Ellen had died in 2010, so she couldn't defend herself. But if you imagine the makings of a monster, it's this kind of household that the story begins in. Bryan told investigators after his arrest that the beatings began when he was just 5 years old. Ellen was a detention officer. Discipline in their house was mental as well as physical. According to Bryan, she used her security belt, and it was like a law enforcement belt, and he usually got hit by the buckle. The defense opted for a bench trial this time, which meant there would be no jury. His lawyers told Judge Suzanne that Bryan's mother, Ellen, also exposed him to violent sexual content. He was exposed to her interests in stuff I can't say and extremely violent films. His lawyer said that Ellen's abuse caused Bryan to develop severe mental health problems. Psychologist Bethany Brand testified that Bryan had developed a condition known as dissociative amnesia, an inability to remember some traumatic events. He feels like there are different TVs playing in his head. She described it as there are two Bryans. There's the one you see over at the defense table who's fairly normal, friends, a job, a dad, a husband, and then there's the killer. There's the bad Bryan. And Bryan claimed to his attorneys that he had no memory of the two murders that he was charged with. Prosecutors undermine the defense claim that he has no memory. They point out that he remembers details of the other stabbings. Now remember, he admitted to stabbing Celeste when he was 16, and in 2020, again, prosecutor, Elizabeth Reamer. Aimee testified that later in their marriage, he grew increasingly violent when they were intimate. And she said she wanted to be as compliant as possible so that I could say to myself, will he love me enough not to kill me? Elizabeth asked her what percentage of your life after he got out of jail in Washington included bondage, pins, or other things that were not normal, like you'd been having in your early marriage. And Aimee said probably about 95%. The trial continued, and after 6 months and 36 witnesses, the judge delivered her verdict. As to count 1, first-degree murder, Angela Brasso is as follows: guilty. Count 2, first-degree murder victim Melanie Bernis, as follows: guilty. And Bryan Miller didn't even react. He didn't show any emotion at all. Now, Angela's mother, who addressed the court remotely, was emotional. She said, "The defendant broke her heart, took all of the hope and light from me and my family. The hole in my heart is so big and empty." Melanie's older sister Jill also spoke remotely about how painful it was that Melanie's life ended at the age of 17. She said, "For 30 years now we've had to live without Melanie because this defendant murdered her. Words cannot even begin to describe the level of excruciating pain we experienced with the news of her horrific death." Bryan Miller, who did not take the stand in his own trial, was allowed to give a statement before he was sentenced. And he said, "I'm not looking for sympathy today. This time is for family and friends of the victim. I cannot imagine what pain they have endured all these years. I know that I am different. I thought it had to do with what my mother did to me." Defense counsel R.J. Parker urged Judge Cohen to show mercy before she delivered her judgment on Bryan Miller's sentence: life in prison or death row. But 8 months after the trial began, Bryan Miller's abuse at the hands of his mother did not dissuade Judge Cohen from handing down the ultimate sentence. She delivered the death penalty and asked Bryan if he wanted to say anything to the court. He said, "I guess thanks for listening to everything that was said and giving us at least the opportunity to try and convince you that I wasn't guilty." Detective Schwarzkopf hopes that family and friends of Angela and Melanie might find some peace. Like Rachel's friend, Melanie Shepmaker, who said that she still misses her good friend to this day. So I'm really sorry about Tater Tot, my neighbor's dog, barking. Usually, again, I film quite a bit earlier, so Tater Tot wanted to join in on this video. I hope it wasn't too terribly distracting. Maybe you can't even hear it, or maybe you're asleep and you don't even notice. Thank you guys so much for being here today. I found this case really disturbing because he continued to get away with these crimes over and over again. And who really knows kind of how he was treating his daughter, if he was kind of this violent man to prey. I don't even know. But the fact that he was like this local celebrity called the Zombie Hunter, and he had just like casually been hanging out with the police and just, this all around kind of jokester, marshmallowy kind of dude really disturbed me in such a way, because I think, we see on the news all this time about, hey, you've probably come in contact with a serial killer, or etc., etc. And I'm like, how many people have I looked into the eyes of that have done something as depraved as this? And it's kind of scary because I really come into contact with a lot of people being in the medical profession, and some of them are not quite so nice. Anyway, thank you so much for listening, and I will see you soon for another video. I'm hoping to get one of the other creepy topics filmed on Wednesday for you guys. I just have to choose which one I want to do. So if you're still awake and you're voting, tell me if you want a location video or creepy stories or